Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Kloepper. She's an associate professor in the Department of Biology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, where she leads the Kloepper Laboratory of Bioacoustics and Animal Behavior. Her research focuses on how animals use sound to explore their environment, and her principal research, which I'm kind of quite intrigued about, investigates how bats in massive swarms use their sonar and flight behavior to navigate in 3 dimensions. And her talk is called Volcanoes, Echoes, Guano, and Cable-Chewing Wildlife. We've all been there. So over to Laura.
Hello everyone, my name is Laura Kloepper and I'm an Associate Professor of Biology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And today I'm going to be talking about volcanoes, echoes, guano, and cable-chewing wildlife deployment solutions for recording in extreme environments. And first of all, I have to say I was really excited to be asked to be part of this webinar because most of the time in science, we just typically report on our nice clean results and we make our methods sound like they were seamless. And it's very rare that we have the opportunity to talk about everything that can possibly go wrong with our work and some of the not so clean behind the scenes tactics that we do to get our equipment to work. So today I'm going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking a lot about things that can go wrong in my field work and solutions that I have come to in order to get the data that I need to answer my research questions. So first of all, just a little bit about me. I study bats in massive swarms. I study the echolocation and flight behavior of bats, primarily at maternal colonies when they're leaving their roost. So I'm just going to play one of my favorite videos from the field here for you. And what I say in that video is, I wear the hat for a reason, lots of bat pee. And we're going to touch on bat pee in just a few minutes. So when I record the bats, I record them outside the cave, I record them inside the cave, and when I record them inside the cave, we have to use proper PPE, so full face respirators, Tyvek suits. We do the complete decontamination protocol before and after we go into the cave. But when I'm outside the cave, one of the biggest challenges I have to deal with is the fact that my bats move. So there's not necessarily, although it's predictable when they're coming out immediately from the cave, what they do after that is unpredictable because, like all wild animals, they like to move. So one of the challenges I have is how to create mobile platforms to capture my bat recordings. So I'm going to be talking a lot about my applications of wildlife acoustics recorders, but I do just want to take a minute to touch on some of the non-wildlife acoustics recorders that I use. So in some of my research, I design custom-built setups. So I use combinations of off-the-shelf components that I kind of deconstruct and put back together in a way that works for me. So one of the mobile platforms that we use is we have taken a drone that we've modified and placed ultrasonic recording equipment and a lightweight thermal camera on it. And we've used that drone to go up at different altitudes to measure bats echolocating at different flight heights primarily when they're returning to the roost in the morning, so they're less dense in groups. We've used that drone with great success. Another one of my techniques that I use is a zip line. So when I'm doing recordings of bats, I need to get right inside the bat swarm of where the bats are recording often if I'm trying to characterize any sort of calls made within the swarm. Here is I'm going to play a video in just a second of what this zip line looks like. The main goal being to get an acoustic recording at the moment at which our unit is exactly in the middle of the bat swarm, approximating the speed of the emerging stream. And I'm going to explain later on in my talk about how I do that with video cameras and how I synchronize video cameras in my acoustic recorder. So I'll just play a video of what the zipline in action looks like here. So you're going to see me release it from the top of the cave here, and it's going to travel along the zipline where it's caught by my postdoc at the bottom. So that's the zipline in action. And then perhaps one of my favorite pieces of mobile equipment is what I call my biological drone. And that is a trained hawk, a trained Harris hawk that we have equipped with a custom-built microphone and camera, and she's then trained to fly right through the swarm of the bats to get video and acoustic data of what it is like right inside the bat swarm, and she flies at different aspect angles to that emerging bat stream. So I'm first going to play for you a sound of the recording from our microphone. This is slowed down 10% the original speed. So it sounds very much like birds chirping. And then a video from the onboard camera, and this is at the same 10% the original speed. So you can see just how close she gets to the bats. So that's kind of the non-wildlife acoustics work that I do, but today's focus is going to be on how I use wildlife acoustics recorders in other components of my work, and most notably the challenges that I have in my field deployment scenarios. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 specific problems: cable chewing wildlife, guano and urine, and heat, dust, and echoes, all of which plague me in everything I do. So first of all, we're going to begin with cable chewing wildlife. So this is a student of mine. When she discovered, after she had left, she was working on a project looking at owl bioacoustics. And we set up the recorders. We were all excited. We put them out. They recorded. And then she went to go retrieve the SD cards. And she came to me and said, "Dr. Kloepper, we have a little bit of a problem." And she showed me what the cables looked like. And we realized that we had an issue of probably some very curious raccoons on our hands that were chewing and destroying, making all of these connectors absolutely worthless on our units. So we had to buy all new replacement equipment, and we had to decide on what to do. And I talked to a couple other scientists who recommended using hot pepper oil, but they also said, do not put it directly on the cables because it could eat through the cables. So our solution for this was to take PVC, which you can see in the picture on the right here, and we enclosed the connector of where the cable connects to the box, as well as high enough where we think the raccoon wouldn't get to it, because we had our units just placed on the ground and then the microphones were up on a tree. Yes, I know raccoons can climb trees, but we put I think it was maybe 1 or 2 meters worth of PVC, just primarily to prevent that connection that was on the ground, because we were finding all the chewing was happening on the ground. So we made sure, though, what was really important was that where it connects to the unit, there's no angle on it. This is why we have this 90-degree angle here. You do not want to put any pressure onto this connection here where it actually attaches to the unit, or it will bend and cause the connectors to basically malfunction over time. So this is why we use this 90 degrees, so that the bend was in the flexible part of the cable. And then we covered the outside of that PVC with hot pepper oil that we made ourselves. You can find several recipes for hot pepper oil online. Here's one that I used. If you want to screenshot this for future reference, you can. Really important. Make sure that you're using proper ventilation when you're making the oil, or you could maybe, pepper spray your house. So just, open your windows, make sure your fan is on. Wear gloves, eye protection. You're working with really hot peppers. And then once you've made the oil, store it in a glass jar, properly labeled, with secondary containment, because it can be really spicy, and sometimes you don't know exactly how spicy your hot pepper oil will be. So you want to make sure that you're using gloves at all times. So the recipe I followed was take about a 1/4 cup of dried crushed chilies, really any kind as long as it's spicy. I had some that I had brought back from Thailand that were excessively spicy, and they worked great. With about a cup of oil, heat the oil for a few minutes over medium heat, and then you pour it over the chilies. I've also seen some variants where you put the chilies into the hot oil and cook it for a few minutes on the stove. That's what you can do, and I actually did that, but you will essentially pepper spray your house if you don't have enough ventilation. So you don't have to do that. You can then just you can heat the oil, pour it over the chilies outside of the pan, and allow it to soak overnight or even longer, depending on how hot you want to make it, and then strain it into a storage jar. And we apply it directly onto that PVC, not on the cables, on the PVC with a cotton swab before deployment. And again, you want to avoid direct contact with the cables. So that was our solution for dealing with cable chewing wildlife, and we never had any incidents after that. So another problem I deal with is when I go into the bat cave, there's a million bats flying all over all over our head. There's a ton of guano on the floor. This photo, oh, I cropped out. There we go. I cropped out the credit. This obviously is not me, but this is a great example of what it's like in the bat caves. Massive piles of guano, dusty. Guano is a biohazard. The urine has salts and has a low pH that can compromise the equipment, so you need to decontaminate and you also need to decontaminate following the white nose syndrome protocol. So my solution for dealing with guano and urine is that I carry these are SM3 units that I was using. I carry them in bags, cloth bags that can be bleached, and then I protect the microphone with a disposable foam cover. Now this does cause some attenuation. We characterize that in the lab, so you do have to worry about attenuation of the sound, but we were recording really close to the bats. We were trying to get sounds of the juveniles in the cave, so we were okay with that attenuation since we were so close. And then in terms of all the equipment in general, we follow the decontamination protocol on all the equipment. On our non-porous equipment, we use a medical grade Lysol, which so far has not shown any degradation of the cables. And we just, again, use bleach for our porous materials, such as the storage bags. But this helps isolate, by carrying everything in these bags, it helps isolate everything above the ground to avoid the dust from the guano. So, speaking of dust, another problem I have is when I'm recording outside of the cave. And this was done for a study in which we were looking at the flight and echolocation behavior of bats when they were re-entering the cave at really fast speeds. And so a little bit about my field site, my primary field site. It is in the middle of the desert of New Mexico on a volcanic landscape. So the volcanic soil is really fine and also has high, I don't know exactly what minerals are in it, but for example, it was getting into the electronic circuit boards of our drone and causing our parachutes to prematurely deploy. And it took us forever to realize there was something about the magnetic properties of that dust or the electrical conductive properties of that dust that was just not good for electronics. So we had to keep it out. And it was even finding its way of working into every single tiny opening it possibly could on all of our equipment. So we had to protect it from dust, but we also had to protect our equipment from heat. The surface temperature of the lava rock in our environment could reach up to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, which was causing our units to shut down and stop recording and just completely malfunction. So we had to deal with the heat and the dust, and then we also had to deal with echoes because we were recording bats that were flying straight towards the ground, and the signals from the bats were reflecting off of the rock and bouncing back, and we were getting overlap between the bat calls that we were interested in recording and the echoes coming back. So those were the three factors in this setup that we had to account for. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about exactly how we went about that with our setup. And I'll caution you, it's not pretty. It's definitely a field hack. This was something we had to deal with on the fly. We got down to the field and we realized we were having all these issues. So we had to use whatever equipment we had on hand because we were 3 hours away from the closest store of any kind to try to solve this problem. So this was definitely a not so clean in the field on the fly hack. So first of all, the volcanic rock causing the overheating and shutdown of the units and the dust. So our solution was we placed the units in a storage bin, a plastic storage bin that we could put a lid on, but we left it partially vented. And that was to help prevent the dust. Then to prevent the overheating, we took a foam mattress pad that we put underneath the storage container, as well as draped it over while still not covering the vent for ventilation, to allow the heat out. And that was to insulate it from radiant heat and solar exposure. And that solution worked really well. So we put it in a secondary bin, and then we had that basically insulation on the top and the bottom of the bin while still allowing it to be vented out. And that worked great for us. So then the other problem was the echoes. So this was a study, as I mentioned before, we were interested in bats that were returning to the cave that basically fly almost vertically to the ground. And so the echoes of the bat calls reflecting off the ground could overlap with the signal of interest. So the solution for this was we calculated what we call the safe distance of signal overlap, and we physically raised the microphone above that distance. So how do you calculate that safe distance? The microphone should be at least as far as half the two-way travel distance for the signal to avoid the call echo overlap. So what does this mean? Let's break this down for you. All right, so basically, if we have an 8-millisecond call, bat call, we want the receiver height to be at least half the two-way travel time, which means the time it takes the bat to emit and then receive the call. So it's bouncing off the ground and coming back, because that's where you can have the overlap between the echo and then another call that the bat might be making, or even the call that the bat has made. So in order to do this, you calculate this by the speed of sound, which on average is 343 meters per second. There's online calculators that can tell you what the speed of sound is depending on temperature and humidity. And then you multiply that by the signal duration in seconds. So in this case, 8 milliseconds, 0.008 seconds. And then you divide that by 2. So in our case, our safe zone was, as long as we had our microphone 1.37 meters above the ground, we should be okay and not have any overlap between the call while the bat is still finishing making the call and any bouncing of the echo off the ground. So we placed our microphones 1.5 meters above the ground. And we did that by putting our microphones on top of tripods. So you can see what this looks like here with our microphones on top of tripods. Now, when you do this, you have essentially made a massive sail for, depending on the weight of your tripod, you've made a massive sail. And if you have high winds, your equipment will get knocked over, which we may have learned on day one. So don't forget to account for that and weigh down those tripods. We used lava rocks that we could find, whatever rocks we could scrounge from our site, and we basically wedged them in. You can see them here, wedged them in around the bases of the tripods. And then we also had, our tripods had hooks on the bottom, and from those hooks, we hung plastic shopping bags that we filled with even more rocks to just get weight down to avoid our units tipping over. As my student said, as she was laughing as we were putting this together, she said, you know, Dr. Kloepper, I've read all these papers and scientists make it sound like science field work is so fancy and there's all this fancy equipment. And here we are loading Trader Joe's bags with rocks to keep our equipment from falling over. And I said, well, it's kind of the reality of field work, and I'm sure many of you can agree with that. So don't forget to account for that. Wind and rain. Also notice that we have our microphones that are pointing ever so slightly down towards the ground because they're omnidirectional to avoid rain, so that rain will just slide right off. All right, so the next and final thing that I'm going to be talking about is audio-video synchronization. Almost all of what I do requires understanding the acoustics with the flight behavior of bats. So I need to synchronize my units to video recordings. And there's no really intuitive way to do that. So I manually synchronize my units to video recorders. So whether I use a series of different cameras for 3D flight reconstruction or single cameras like on the Hawk or the Zipline, I do a manual synchronization, which sounds fancy, but really I just have a visual and acoustic marker, which for me, I take metal tripods and I hit them together 3 times so that you have that acoustic marker in your recording, and then you have the video marker, and you can get it down to the frame accuracy because you're banging 2 objects together really quickly. For long-term recordings, I do continuous recordings up to 2 hours sometimes. We have to repeat this every 5 minutes, and this is key. If you're doing long-term recordings, you need to repeat every 5 minutes to account for frame drift, which can happen in video recordings. And then a sample lag. We found that when the SM3 unit generated a new file every, I think it's 32, 36 minutes, there would be a little bit of a sample lag. It wasn't continuous. Something about creating that new file had a couple 100 milliseconds, if I recall properly, maybe less than that. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Some sort of sample lag. So every 5 minutes, we repeated this synchronization. Now, I don't exactly have a video of what this looks like for the current image, but I can show you what this looked like for our zipline. You'll see what this looks like. So back to the zipline that I mentioned at the beginning, I want to point out a few things. We used a series of cameras because we wanted to make sure our recorder was right in the middle of the bat swarm, and we pulled out the synchronized acoustic recording. So we have actually a camera over here. We have a GoPro. We have a GoPro that's generating the video that you see here. And then we had a camera unit that was on our zipline up here as well. So what you're going to notice is my student up here, she's going to bash that tripod together 3 times before I launch my unit. And I'll turn up the audio, and hopefully you'll hear that acoustic marker as well. So nothing fancy, just really bashing 2 things together. And you just want to make sure that if you're trying to synchronize acoustic and video, that you're doing it loud enough so that you can hear it on your acoustic recording, and then where it's visible in your video. And I will say that post-processing, it takes a lot to try to line up your audio and video. It can be a little bit complex, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes like second nature moving forward. That wraps up what I wanted to share with you guys. I had a lot of fun putting this together and sharing this. Do have to acknowledge my work is funded by NSF, ONR, Fish and Wildlife. And you can find me on Google Scholar or follow me on Twitter, and I look forward to answering all your questions. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck with your research.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was brilliant. I think we all want a hawk now. If you can do sort of like a breeding program and deliver as a bat hawk, that'd be amazing. We have questions coming in thick and fast. The first one we've got here is actually regarding your hawk. I think you're going to get a lot of questions about that. Do the bats react negatively to the hawk flying through the middle of the swarm? Do they try and avoid it, or are they just quite happy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I get that a lot. And yes, I agree. I think my favorite piece of equipment that I have is my hawk. I call it my hawk. She doesn't actually live with me. She's trained by a master falconer and kept in her happy home in New Mexico. But yeah, it's really interesting. So I'll try not to go too much into depth with my answer, because I could use up the rest of my time answering this one question. But there's actually wild hawks at my field site that prey upon the bats. And so we did a whole study on the behavior of the hawks and the behavior of the bats and anti-predator behavior and why that influences bat grouping. It just got published in Behavioral Ecology. So if you're into that, go look it up. It's super cool. But the bats respond to the wild hawks. But what's really interesting is that the bats are not responding to our trained hawk whatsoever when the hawk flies through the bats. And we actually thought at the beginning, this kind of goes into things that can go wrong with your recording and your deployment. We were expecting the bats to respond, and we were hoping that with our hawk, we would be able to get any sort of anti-predator response to see, are the bats making a vocalization, or how are the bats responding to a predator? And we found out that they weren't. So they had, I mean, in fact, that the hawk would smack right into the side of the bats, because the hawk never targeted the bats, because the hawk wasn't trained and didn't recognize them as prey. So the hawk would just fly right through the bats, smack into the side of the bats, no issue there. But that is now opening the door to some really interesting questions we have on the perception of the bats when they're navigating in those groups. So why are they not responding to the hawk? Are they not perceiving the hawk? Is it because of how they're using their sonar in these groups and these configurations that's why they're not responding to it? So the fact that we didn't get the answers or the behavioral response we expected is now opening the door for us to explore some different questions on bat sensing.
5 more PhDs have just opened up.
Exactly, right?
Going back to your recipe.
Yes.
First presentation I've seen with a recipe. Did you ever try commercial anti-chew spray for dogs, like bitter apple and things like that, to be a little bit more convenient, so you didn't have to go and pepper gas your house, basically?
No, actually I didn't. So I think I did the hot pepper oil my first year as an assistant professor, which any of you that are new PhDs are in that period, you know that you do things that are probably not the best in hindsight. I didn't. Someone had just said, oh, try hot pepper oil. It really worked for us. And so I did it. And I just happened to have all the hot peppers at home. And I was desperate because I wanted a solution that would work, that day. And so I did pepper spray my house, which is why I tell everybody to be so cautious. But I don't know. I'd be interested to hear if anybody's using the bitter apple and if that works for them.
Well, to follow up on that, there was a bat conference I went to, and there was a whole discussion about things nibbling these types of microphones. and there were people just getting off the shelf like chili sauce and which one worked best. And there was just a whole discussion, not a conference thing, just a group of people talking about different brands of chili sauce. I don't know what the outcome was. So, what have we got here? Is there some automated solution for synchronizing audio and video that, in other words, to get rid of that manual work to stop it being repeated every 5 minutes?
Absolutely. There's a lot of different solutions that come with very hefty price tags. So I know that there's some companies that will build custom solutions for scientists. They will do, so I have a lot of really smart electrical engineer collaborators that help me with a lot of my work. And I know that you could use a microcontroller and with the inputs from the cameras and the microphones, you can put it all together. But we were using the wildlife acoustics recorders, which it's not really easy to hack the electronics of those, nor did I want to. And so I didn't want to start messing with that. But it does get very expensive if you want to do that. I know that some people, and we thought about doing this approach, that you can have if you have a camera that has an audio input, you can get a secondary bat detector and have the bat detector running with your microphone, and then have that as an audio input into your camera, and you can use it that way. And we tried that a little bit, but it wasn't really working as well for us as just bashing the tripod every 5 minutes. I mean, we would go in the morning to watch the re-entry because it's amazing to see it. So we were sitting there anyways, and I needed to keep my students awake. So I said, okay, every 5 minutes, go and bash in front of the tripod. That was our budget-friendly solution. I mean, I think most scientists were always looking for a hack that works, that is budget-friendly, and it works for us. And having to do it every 5 minutes can be an inconvenience depending on your deployment. But if you're trying to save money, it's a really easy solution.
No, that's good. I like saving money. I'm from Yorkshire, so we never spend money where I'm from. But there's two more questions here, which are quite really related to what you were doing. What size PVC worked best to protect your cables?
Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, speaking of budget friendly, I just went and borrowed some PVC from my lab equipment, like from my teaching lab. I think it was PVC that we used for if you notice, there were holes in mine because we use it as a transect in my marine biology class, or a quadrat in my marine biology class. So I think it was like 1/2 inch, but it doesn't matter as long as you can just fit your cables and your connectors through it. But I think it was like 1/2 inch PVC.
No, that's cool. And one question, one was put in the chat, one was put in the Q&A, so we asked them both together, really. Have rabbits or cows ever had an issue with chewing cables?
Rabbits and cows? So it could have been a rabbit. I don't know. There's no livestock. Well, not where I had the issue with that recorder, but where I do my field work, we have to worry about buffalo. That's a whole other issue, the bison. Thankfully they didn't come to our equipment, but I have no idea. And I'm sure other people on this webinar have an answer to that. Maybe if someone knows, they can put that in the chat.
I had a cow which ate an SM2 completely, apart from the batteries and the SD card, which was fortunate because I at least got my data, but ate the whole thing. That was all gone. So there's one last question. I think we've got time for one last question. I'm sure you know the studies using microphone crosses to triangulate the bats acoustically and record the call. Why did you decide against those?
Great question. So the reason why is that 2 reasons. Number one, the bats were really far away from the microphones. And so we were also interested in tracking the bats before the acoustic recordings were audible. Okay, number one. Number two, we were also looking at, and we're wrapping up this manuscript and hope to submit it soon. We're also looking at wing beats and how bats, when they're coming back at high speeds, are moving their wings, which you can't do if you're doing acoustic localization. So with our cameras, we had high enough resolution cameras where we could actually see the bat head, the bat tail, and the bat wing tips. So it was more than just tracking the individual point of the bat. It was also looking at those fine scale anatomical markers. And then also we wanted to know what the bats were doing in between calls, because often we were looking at if the bats were making changes in their trajectory at the point at time in which it was coinciding with echoreception, or if they were making movements in between producing acoustic signals. So we needed that what was happening with the bat's movement in between really, really long IPIs or interpulse intervals, like hundreds and hundreds of milliseconds. So it was just to get finer resolution into the kinematics of the bats.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for answering all these questions and staying online, and a wonderful presentation as well, which I think has got everybody thinking, I now want a bat hawk for the UK. So thank you very much. I'm sure questions will keep appearing in the Q&A.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me speak today.